Hi again. In this next video, we're going to talk about safety in the context of walking and biking. Because walkers and bikers are fairly unprotected from car traffic, planning for safety is an incredibly central part of planning for walking and biking. So, as I've mentioned previously, walkers and bikers are very often described as vulnerable users, and this vulnerability is really demonstrated by the outsized proportion of injuries and fatalities that are associated with walkers and bicyclists. So while in the United States only just about 3% of commutes are made by walking and about 10% of trips are made by walking, about 5% of traffic injuries are pedestrians and 14% of fatalities are pedestrians. So pedestrians are getting injured and killed at really disproportionately high rates. Likewise, with bicycles, only a little more than 0.5% of commutes are by bike, and about 1% of trips are made by bike, and yet 7.2% of traffic injuries are bicyclists, and 2.2% of traffic fatalities are bicyclists. And so if we think about the risk of being injured or killed on a per trip level, it's substantially larger for bicycles and pedestrians than it is on average. And that average, of course, is primarily composed of trips by car. One of the most important things to understand about bicycle and pedestrian safety is that the speed at which cars travel has a lot to do with the severity of the outcome for bicycles and pedestrians when they get hit by a car, which is the predominant way that bicycles and pedestrians get injured or killed, is to be hit by an automobile. So if a car is traveling at about 25 miles per hour, then a pedestrian who's hit, statistically speaking, has about a 90% chance of survival. They're still going to be injured, but they're very likely to survive at just 25 miles per hour. As soon as you take that up to 35 miles per hour, the chance of survival goes down to about 60%. So this is a non-linear curve. And by 45 miles per hour, so just 10 miles per hour more, that chance of survival goes down to 35%. And so setting speed limits and then enforcing speeds and designing streets so that it's uncomfortable for motorists to go faster than, say, 25 miles per hour is a really important tactic for improving safety for bicyclists and pedestrians. In general, there have been some important improvements in bicyclist and pedestrian safety over the last couple decades. We've gone from about 35 pedestrian fatalities per million people in 1980 down to about 15 in 2013. So that's less than half of the rate that it was 3 decades earlier. And bicyclists have also seen a really significant reduction in the likelihood of being killed on a bicycle. That said, there are also some really substantial safety disparities between different cities. And one of the really important trends that we notice is that the more people are biking and walking, the safer it becomes. So there's an aspect here of safety in numbers. When biking and walking becomes fairly commonplace, when drivers are aware of this activity because it's common, and when there's just simply more bikes and pedestrians on the roads together, so there's sort of a critical mass, in a given place, it does improve safety because those users are just more visible. So for example, in Portland, Oregon, which is the U.S. city with the highest proportion of bicycle commuters, somewhere around 6%, it also has a relatively low fatality rate, somewhere around 1 fatality per 10,000 bicycle commuters. But in cities that have much lower percentages of bicycle commuters, they tend to have much higher fatality rates. And we see a really similar trend in the context of walking. So Boston, for example, has a very high proportion of its commuters that walk to work and a relatively low fatality rate for walking commuters. A sad but important trend to be aware of is that there are some pretty substantial racial disparities in terms of safety for pedestrians. A study that came out in 2015 tested the response of drivers to pedestrians who were waiting to cross in a crosswalk. and found that cars were twice as likely to ignore that pedestrian and go right through the crosswalk, which is potentially endangering that pedestrian, for black pedestrians than for white pedestrians. So white pedestrians, were twice as likely to have the car stop and yield to them. So this just underscores how building safety-oriented infrastructure like crosswalks, for example, doesn't on its own guarantee the safety of the people using them, but rather there's some really important social context in terms of whether drivers behave safely in their interactions with pedestrians. And it's important for planners to consider how there might be some really substantial biases in whether or how drivers behave safely in those interactions. So while there have been some definite improvements in safety for pedestrians and cyclists in the last couple decades, there's still a really long way that we can go, especially in the US context. Compared to some of our European peers, as demonstrated in this graph, pedestrians and cyclists in the US have considerably greater risk per distance traveled. So among pedestrians in the US, for example, almost 10 are killed per 100 million kilometers that is walked, and that is more than double the rate in the UK, which is again also much higher than the rates in some of these other countries. Rates for cyclist injuries are literally off this chart at more than 6 times greater than the UK. And so there's clearly a lot of room for improvement in the US context.